Good morning and welcome to another ironic introduction to another video. So you want to run Suicide Masteries. Maybe you're a new player and you're just finding out that you are dedicated to that arena grind, or you're a veteran who's finally decided to start chipping away at Masteries. Let me tell you that Suicide Masteries are a pretty penny to cost. So first I'm going to go over Suicide Masteries, just do a quick rundown of the setups. I don't want to put too much effort into it as there's plenty of content out there of Suicide Mastery setups, and I don't feel like I need to add to that. But just to be aware, you do need 15 points in offense before you can even begin to think about unlocking them. And naturally, you are going to go for this precision and this cruelty. If you are concerned about unit cost and you really just want to grind straight to those Suicide Masteries, let me tell you that that is the wrong decision. I will make a video discussing the numbers here, but precision and cruelty here are for you just strictly free damage, and the amount of damage from that is better than running suicides, so go ahead and unlock those first. Not to mention that it is significantly cheaper to unlock these two masteries than it is to unlock suicides, as well as the fact that you need 15 points in here anyways, and you're better off dumping them here than you are into like dumping them into greater strength, etc. At least when you're at the point where you're committing units. Next up is Glass Cannon, and I did cap this all the way at one point because kind of in the progression I'll talk about that. And then you have Recoil, which is whenever you use a special 1 or a special 2, you take 5% of your health. You'll never bring it past that point. You do additional damage on your specials, but that's notable, just not worth the trade, unfortunately. Liquid Courage, you take up to 30% increased attack for 0.6% health lost each second. And the real negative effect here is that Poison debuff causes a 30% healing regeneration loss. So your heals are only 70% effective. And Double Edge, you start the fight with up to 30% increased damage, but in return you are losing 1.25% health per second for X number of seconds, somewhere between 8 and 16 when you cap. If you are gonna run this, I highly recommend that you cap it, as the 10% over 8 seconds is not worth it, just because when you go to mitigate it, it's much stronger at the 30%, because once it's mitigated, you're getting more damage for the mitigation, but only if you pump points into it. Next, you're going to want 15 points in the defense tree. I'll discuss in a later video just like the value of why I think energy resistance is better than physical resistance, but at the very least what you're going to want to do is stick 3 points in recovery here, and that is because this is going to synergize with the ability Willpower over here. And when you unlock Willpower, you want to put at least 1 point into it, and we'll talk about that progression later, but at 1 point you do get 0.5% health regeneration per second, which is reduced down to like 0.35, was reduced to 0.35 from poison, but that is okay. It still counteracts the amount of damage you are taking and is strongly worth. And then you have Coagulate here, which is for like higher developed Suicide Mastery builds, and this will reduce your damage taken from any bleed buff or bleed passive effect up to 30%. And then finally, just in proficiencies, I would like to point out that if you are running suicides, you should highly consider having a maxed parry, as well as nope, just the max parry is what I wanted to point out there. And the reason I make that statement is because you want to mitigate as much damage as possible, and so having a max parry can really help in that situation. So when it comes to talking about suicides, there's like a standard progression, right? So first things first, I did make a tier list for the champions, and I will link the description to this Google Doc, but I will be utilizing this when I speak about Suicide Masteries and talking about having X number of champions. But first things first, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take in consideration what you do when you play this game. So when you jump in, if you are in an active alliance, let's say your alliance is active in war. And so this is really the biggest hindrance when you are active in war, because when you go to place heroes, you want to place heroes that are suicide friendly. So I don't have that, and as a result, I run what I would call a base Suicide Mastery setup, because you can see only Nebula here is Suicide Mastery friendly, and you can see that on my list. And as a result, it kind of hinders my alliance. That means anybody who goes up against these when I'm defending is pretty much an easier fight, right? My champions are deteriorating over time and their champions are not, and that is a negative impact. So you do want to take note that you need 5 champions for Alliance War defense, 3 champions for Alliance War offense, and if your alliance is active in Quest as well, you will need an additional 3 there, so that's 11 champions. And if you are active in Quest and trying to progress in quests as well, you're going to need an additional 5 champions there. So anywhere between 5 and 16 champions is how many you're going to need that are Suicide Mastery friendly in order to justify this. And so that's why I kind of recommend for beginners, people who are entering their way into Suicide Masteries, that I can slow down here a little bit now that I've gotten through the bulk of the fluff. My general suggestion for people who are like trying to work their way into Suicides is first, start by maxing out Liquid Glass Cannon. I don't have it maxed out because I'm actually in the progress of transitioning into the next step, but start by maxing out Glass Cannon. Glass Cannon is going to go all the way up to 7.2%, 7.2%. I believe you only have to unlock it once, so it is just a handful of units to unlock it all the way. And before you have the ability to unlock like Liquid Courage and as well as Willpower, especially as someone who doesn't have the units or is a new player and doesn't have the mastery points, like that's where I'm gated, is on the mastery points. You're going to find that this 7% damage is really worth, and it does kind of tie you over. You still feel it, not as much as the 30% damage you would get from Suicides, but it's a strong kind of like suspended tie-in, at least for a small duration of time. Then as soon as you can, when you find yourself in a position where you can unlock Willpower, you can then go ahead and unlock Liquid Courage. And that is because of the way the math works out, and I'll just show you here. I do discuss this in my best champions to rank up for Suicide Masteries, but the short run, the TLDR, is that when you run max Liquid Courage with 1 point in Willpower, each champion you have has 506 seconds to live. Essentially, before they die to that poison debuff, you have 506 seconds. But when you are running Double Edge with 1 point in Willpower, you only have 150 seconds, and so what this means is when you're running non-Suicide Mastery friendly champions, as in champions who don't have poison or bleed immunities or any kind of mitigation, you get the same 30% from your Willpower, from your Liquid Courage, but you have significantly longer to live. And it should be worth mentioning that when this 148 seconds does translate strictly to a number of fights. So like keep in mind that even maxed out, that Double Edge is only 16 seconds long. So when it comes to 148, you would have the ability to bring that champion to 9.25 fights. But the reason I make the argument that you're better off running Liquid Courage is because, especially earlier on in the game, a lot of your fights will take a very short period of time, and so with that in mind, you can blast through those fights incredibly quickly. So taking this 9.25 and the 506 seconds, you would have, if your fights are lasting less than 54 seconds a fight, then you would be able to get more fights in with that champion than you would get from running Double Edge. So that is the reason why I think you should take Liquid Courage first. But if you have a number of bleed immune champions, then there is definitely more value in bringing bleed immunity instead. Just for new players, if you're planning on running Suicides, my general recommendation is, if you are only questing a completely non-active alliance, you would want at least 4 champions who are Suicide Mastery friendly, preferably in one or the other categories. Like, they're either all in the poison and both category or all in the both and bleed category, and this is before you have Willpower. Once you have Willpower, you can start running champions that aren't suicide immune. I do run champions that are not suicide immune in questing, just because I don't feel the need I'm not at a stage where the fights are so long that I'm being punished enough. But the reason I say 4 and not 5 is because I am a big believer of people who are pushing newer content and they're like really trying to see how far they can push in the story, that you should run your Heimdall. If you don't have a Heimdall, that's unfortunate. Then I would up that number to 5. But if you have a Heimdall, even a 3-star Heimdall, I would stick him in there. You would be amazed by how many times I have accidentally pushed someone into a special 3, or you're going up against like a Mordo, and he just power gains into his special 3, and I have survived that special 3 and been able to end the fight winning and saved myself a revive. And yes, you still have to use health potions, but health potions are significantly easier to come by than revives. And I think there's a lot of value in that. Not to mention, like, in specific events like the Nameless Thanos, having that extra, essentially an extra life, right? Because you die so fast anyways, having that virtually extra stock is definitely worth more, because it becomes 4 extra stocks on your team at the loss of 1 champion. And it's not even a loss, because Heimdall is a solid utility champion to have in your team. So that being said, minimum 4 if you're questing. If you are doing Alliance War, I would say don't participate in with Suicide Masteries if you're participating in Alliance War, unless you have a minimum of 7 champions, again, including that's based on having a Heimdall in one of those slots, or until you have willpower. And if you have willpower, then you can run this setup that I have here. And then for if you are doing all of the above, I would say you definitely just want to have willpower, because if you don't have willpower, I don't think you're in a position to do everything in the game between Alliance War, Alliance Quest, and questing. You're going to have to sacrifice something. And I do typically sacrifice my questing. I go back and I do easier content while I am active in my alliance, and then I clear tougher content when I am not, just to kind of maximize my ability to commit the most to my alliance as possible. So that said, this is the half Suicide Mastery setup. And when you are doing this setup, you can actually do Liquid Courage or Double Edge. Do keep in mind that I believe Double Edge is more expensive for the initial unlock. So a lot of people go Liquid Courage just because it's cheaper. But again, the only reason you would go Double Edge is if on this tier list, like if you're sitting on more champions here in the Bleed Immune Champ roster, or / both, than you are in the Poison, then you would go Double Edge. But otherwise, you should almost always go Poison first, just because, particularly in Alliance War, you get more out of it. And the reason for that is the strict amount of damage you're losing just to bleed. It's absolutely ridiculous, unless your alliance is willing to let you stack all your defenders on the bleed immune node. So that being said, you run this half Suicide Mastery setup, and that is because 1 point in willpower negates the heck out of this Liquid Courage, even maxed, and 3 points in willpower would make it completely negligible. And then as far as like moving into a progressed Suicide Mastery setup, you're going to either want to start thinking about dumping extra points into willpower, but like for me, I would say your priority should be setting up this basis and then moving on to like more viable nodes like Stupefy and Petrify, as I believe those 2 nodes are incredibly valuable and should be maxed out before you even think about moving past a half Suicide portion. Just as like value of the masteries, I think you're going to get more out of those. But then when you start thinking about running Double Edge, what you're going to want to do is unlock it and not run it yet, which is painful, but at least you're in that position. And then you're like, okay, I have extra points. I don't really want to dip into this Despair or this Deep Wounds. I'm not running champions that would benefit majorly off of those. You're going to go ahead and go back and start dumping extra points into Glass Cannon, at least while you're holding off. Because while you're holding off, there's nothing you can do with those points. And, you do still get free damage there. And then when you're finally at a position, because I make the argument that you only want to run Double Edge when it's maxed. I don't think it's worth running at rank 1. But when you're in a position where you can finally max Double Edge and you have the Bleed Immune champions, then you're going to go ahead and max it out all at once. And then you're ready to run Suicides. Something I would note is that if you are active in Alliance War and you plan on running Double Edge and you're not running Bleed Immune champions on defense, I would stick at least 1 point in Coagulate if you can, because this will reduce the damage by 10%. I do the math in the video, but 1 point in Coagulate, 1 point in Willpower, with maxed Suicides on both ends will give your champions a 108-second lifespan over the course of multiple fights. That's essentially assuming your bleed is going to be infinite. But that 10% damage reduction is really nice. If you can afford the mastery points, you're going to want to stick all 3 in there. But sometimes that's just not something you can afford to do as you get gated by masteries, or especially if you're like, I really want to spare, I really want Deep Wounds, or if you want Mystic Dispersion, which is very valuable. And so that's kind of how you progress through Suicides. I just think that a lot of people overlook this Glass Cannon, and a lot of people think like, oh, when you run Suicides, you jump in and you take both. No, it is definitely a strong champion pool consideration. Because if you don't have the champions for it in order to progress running suicides without being extremely punished for it, it's not worth, right? You do save a lot of time in the arena, but if you're not doing only arena, which if you are doing only arena, you should probably reevaluate how you spend your time on the game. I do make a video on for casual players with limited time on how you should prioritize your grind. But you really want to consider it in your champion rank ups. So all of my rank ups have been generally revolved around defender placement / my suicide masteries. So you can see I have Omega Red, Ronin, Hyperion, Gladiator, Hulk. All 4 of those are champions that are suicide mastery friendly, with Omega Red being immune, Ronin being someone who can shrug. And then you can see that I'm continuing to rank up Luke Cage, Ghost, and then I have champions ranked up for arena. Magic is like a special note because she can ignore the recoil effect. And then like champions like Wolverine, this is one of the original ones I ranked up before I had a larger roster. The regeneration plus the willpower can really help mitigate suicide masteries. And so in this manner, you can rank up champions and not be negatively impacted by suicide masteries as much. So at this point, I feel like I've gone over everything I want to. You probably clicked off this video 60 seconds ago, but that's okay. I like to hear myself talk. But for now, I'll talk to you later.